There is a sentence that most people have heard, in one form or another, enough times that it has begun to lose its meaning through overuse. The sentence is that you must love yourself before you can love others. It appears on social media. It is offered as advice after breakups and disappointments. It is included in the introductory chapters of self-help books, alongside other well-intentioned phrases that gesture in the right direction, without quite landing on what they are actually pointing at. And because it has been repeated so many times in contexts that are more inspirational than genuinely illuminating, many people have come to understand it as a kind of emotional hygiene instruction, a reminder to practice self-care, to set aside time for yourself, to say kind things to yourself in the mirror in the morning. Carl Jung never said it quite that way. But what he did say, across decades of clinical observation and deep personal investigation, points to something considerably more precise and considerably more demanding than the version that has become conventional wisdom. He said that how you love yourself is how you teach others to love you, and this is not a slight variation on the familiar phrase. It is a genuinely different claim, one that shifts the question from whether you love yourself to the quality and the structure of that love, and one that places the relationship between self-love and the love you receive from others in a framework that has nothing to do with inspiration and everything to do with the actual psychology of how human beings relate to themselves and to each other. This video will explore what Jung meant by this, not as a motivational exercise, not as a set of affirmations to be adopted, but as a genuine investigation into what it actually means to love yourself in the psychological sense. What the absence of that love actually produces in your relationships, what the development of it actually requires, and what genuinely changes in the specific texture of how other people relate to you when your relationship to yourself begins to shift. Number 1, what you model, others follow. The most direct way into what Jung is saying is through the concept of modeling. Not conscious modeling, not the deliberate communication of how you want to be treated through the explicit statements you make about your own preferences and boundaries, but the unconscious modeling that occurs through the patterns of your own self-relationship as it becomes legible to the people around you. Jung observed, across many years of clinical work, that the way a person relates to themselves creates a template that the significant people in their life tend to follow. Not because those people are passive or lacking in their own independent character, but because the relationship you have with yourself communicates, through 1,000 small and largely unconscious signals, what you believe you deserve, what you expect, what you will accept and what you will not, and what kind of treatment feels normal and natural to you because it corresponds to how you already treat yourself. When you consistently dismiss your own feelings as excessive or unreasonable, the people around you learn that your feelings are available for dismissal. Not because you have told them this, but because the pattern of your self-dismissal creates a precedent that shapes the emotional atmosphere of all your relationships. When you consistently prioritize everyone else's needs over your own, not out of genuine and freely chosen generosity, but out of the belief that your needs are less important or less legitimate, the people around you learn that your needs come last. Again, not because anyone decided this consciously, because the pattern you model makes it the path of least resistance. This is not a question of whether the people around you are good people or bad people, caring people or indifferent people. It is a question of the unconscious structure of the interaction, the structure that you, through your own self-relationship, help to create. Jung was clear that this dynamic is not the fault of the person who has not yet learned to love themselves more adequately. It is the natural consequence of a pattern that was formed before the person had any conscious choice in the matter, typically in childhood, when the way the early environment related to you became the template for how you related to yourself, and therefore for how others would continue to relate to you throughout your life. Number 2. The wound behind the absence of self-love. One of the most important things to understand about the absence of self-love, in the Jungian sense, is that it is never simply a character flaw or a personal failing. It is always the consequence of a specific and early experience in which the developing self was not adequately met, not adequately recognized, valued, protected, or received in the particular way that was most necessary at a particular moment. Jung did not use the language of self-love as frequently as contemporary psychology does, but his understanding of what he called the inadequate development of the self, the condition in which the person does not have access to a stable inner sense of their own worth that is independent of external validation, maps almost precisely onto what contemporary psychology means when it speaks about the absence of self-love, and his account of how this condition develops is both more precise and more compassionate than most of the popular accounts that have followed his work. The child who arrives in a family or an environment that does not have the capacity to adequately meet them, to receive and reflect back the particular qualities and the particular aliveness that this specific child brings, does not conclude that the environment has failed them. The child concludes that they are the problem, that the inadequacy is theirs, that the qualities they brought, the intensity, the sensitivity, the specific form of their aliveness and their need, were the things that caused the failure of the meeting. And from that conclusion, very early, and before there are words for it, the child develops a relationship to their own inner life that is organized around the belief that it is too much or not enough, or wrong in some specific way that must be managed and corrected rather than simply expressed and received. This belief becomes the foundation of the person's self-relationship for the rest of their life, unless it is genuinely addressed. Not through affirmations, not through the decision to believe something different, not through the intellectual recognition that the early conclusion was wrong, but through the actual experience of a different kind of meeting, through the development of a relationship with their own inner life that does not reproduce the inadequacy of the original environment, but that offers instead what the original environment could not: genuine recognition, genuine reception, the steady, honest, compassionate presence that meets what is actually there rather than what would have been more convenient or more comfortable to receive. Number 3. What self-love actually looks like as a psychological practice. Here is where the Jungian framework becomes most specifically useful, because it moves the question of self-love from the domain of attitude and affirmation into the domain of actual psychological practice. And the practice it describes is more demanding and more interesting than any of the popular versions of self-love would suggest. Jung described what he called the encounter with the self as the central work of the individuation process, and the self as he understood it is not the pleasant, approved, socially presentable version of who you are. It is the totality, including everything that has been suppressed, denied, hidden in the shadow, judged as unacceptable or inconvenient or too much, and protected against exposure through whatever defensive patterns were developed in childhood to manage the gap between who you actually are and who the environment required you to be. Self-love, in this framework, is not the approval of the approved self. It is the genuine and honest reception of the total self, including the shadow, including the parts that do not correspond to any flattering self-image, including the needs that feel shameful, the feelings that feel excessive, the desires that feel inappropriate, the fears that feel too small or too large or simply too inconvenient to acknowledge. The genuine reception of all of this, not with uncritical approval of every impulse, but with honest and compassionate acknowledgement that this is what is actually here, in this person, in this life, as it actually is, rather than as it has been required to present itself to the world. This is considerably more difficult than the popular version of self-love. It requires a quality of honest self-attention that most people have never developed. Not the attention that selectively notices what is pleasant and deflects what is uncomfortable, but the attention that can remain present to the full range of inner experience without immediately moving to manage, suppress, judge, or redirect whatever arises that does not fit the approved self-image. A man I know described his first genuine encounter with this kind of self-attention as one of the most uncomfortable experiences of his adult life. He had considered himself a self-aware person. He had read widely, he was emotionally articulate, he was genuinely interested in personal development. But what he discovered, when he began to sit with his inner experience in a genuinely honest way, rather than in the way organized around presenting a flattering account of himself, even to himself, was a landscape he had not known was there. Resentments he had told himself he did not feel, needs he had dismissed as inappropriate for someone of his apparent capability, fears he had covered with competence for so long that he had genuinely forgotten they were there, and a quality of loneliness, very old and very persistent, that had been present throughout his entire adult life beneath the impressive functioning that had made him seem, including to himself, like someone who was doing fine. The self-love that began to develop in him as he learned to remain present to this fuller picture was not comfortable or flattering, but it was real, and that reality, that quality of genuine self-reception that included what was difficult alongside what was easier to acknowledge, was what began to change how he moved through the world and what the world reflected back to him. Number 4. The pattern in relationships and where it comes from. When the relationship to the self is organized around the belief that the inner life, in its full reality, is not acceptable, not worthy of genuine reception, not something to be offered as it actually is, but only in carefully managed and edited form, this belief shapes every significant relationship the person enters, not through conscious intention, but through the structural logic of how the psyche organizes its encounters with others. The person who does not genuinely receive themselves tends to create relationships in which they are not genuinely received. This is not a punishment, and it is not a coincidence. It is the predictable consequence of a self-relationship that models inadequate reception as the standard, and that therefore organizes itself around partners and friends and colleagues who reproduce, in various forms and with various levels of severity, the original inadequacy. Jung called this the psychology of projection and identification. The person who carries the belief that they are not genuinely worth receiving tends to project this belief outward, to see it reflected in the responses of others, even when those responses are ambiguous or actually quite positive, and to identify with partners who seem to confirm the belief through their own patterns of emotional unavailability or inconsistency or conditional engagement. Not because the person is attracted to bad treatment, in any conscious sense, but because the familiar resonates in a way that the unfamiliar does not. The person who grew up in an environment of conditional love will experience conditional love as recognizable, as normal, as the texture of what love is, in a way that makes unconditional love feel strange and difficult to inhabit, however much it may be desired. This is the mechanism by which how you love yourself teaches others how to love you, not through explicit instruction, but through the unconscious template of your own self-relationship, which creates the emotional atmosphere in which certain kinds of treatment feel comfortable and expected, and others feel inexplicably unfamiliar, even when the unfamiliar is what would be genuinely more nourishing. Number 5. When the self-relationship begins to change. The change in the quality of relationships that follows the genuine development of self-love is not immediate, and it is not simple. It does not occur because you have decided to love yourself more and have communicated this decision to the people around you. It occurs because the underlying template has genuinely shifted in the way that only genuine psychological change shifts things, through actual experience of a different kind of inner encounter rather than through the adoption of a different belief. When you genuinely begin to receive your own inner experience differently, when you begin to meet what is actually there rather than immediately managing it into an acceptable form, several things happen in succession. The first is that your tolerance for certain kinds of treatment drops. Not because you have decided to have higher standards, but because the treatment that was once familiar and therefore comfortable no longer feels comfortable in the same way. The gap between how you are beginning to treat yourself and how certain people are treating you becomes more legible, more noticeable. More clearly a gap, rather than simply the normal texture of how relationships work. This is not a comfortable development. It often creates disruption in relationships that were previously stable. People who were comfortable in the dynamic created by your old self-relationship are not always comfortable with the shift. The person who relied on your automatic availability, on your reflexive accommodation, on your consistent positioning of your needs as secondary, may feel that you have changed in a way that is inconvenient for them, and in a sense that is accurate. You have changed. The dynamic has changed. The unconscious template that governed the relationship is no longer operating in quite the same way. Some relationships survive this disruption and deepen. The people who are genuinely present in them discover that the more honest and more self-respecting version of you is actually more available for genuine contact than the previous version was, because the genuine version is actually there in a way that the managed version could never fully be. Other relationships do not survive the disruption, because they were organized around the old template in a way that the new one does not support. And while the ending of a relationship is always painful, regardless of its necessity, the relationships that end as a result of this kind of development tend to be the ones that were least genuinely nourishing. Number 6. What love actually requires of the self before it can be genuinely given. There is a direct and consequential connection, in Jung's understanding, between the quality of the relationship a person has with themselves and the quality of love they are capable of genuinely offering to others. Not the performance of love, not the behavior of a loving person, not the various ways of demonstrating care that can be learned and enacted, even in the complete absence of genuine inner connection, but love in the fuller sense, the kind that actually reaches the other person, that meets them where they are rather than where it would be convenient for them to be, that can hold their reality, including its complexity and its difficulty, without requiring them to be simpler or less or other than they actually are. This kind of love requires something that the person who does not yet love themselves in any genuine way is not yet in possession of. It requires genuine inner stability, the capacity to be genuinely present to another person without being pulled away from your own center by the encounter, to care about what they are experiencing without losing the thread of your own experience, to be moved by their reality without being overwhelmed by it, to remain genuinely yourself while also genuinely meeting them, without genuine inner stability, without a real and rooted sense of your own presence in your own life. What tends to happen in close relationships is what Jung called inflation and merger. The person who does not have a stable inner center tends to organize their sense of self around the relationship itself, around the partner's experience and the partner's needs and the partner's response to them, in a way that produces not genuine love but a form of enmeshment, in which the distinction between self and other becomes increasingly blurred. In this enmeshed state, what is offered in the name of love is very often not the other person's needs that are being attended to. It is the self's needs, mediated through the fiction of devotion to the other. The person who loses themselves completely in caring for their partner is not, from Jung's perspective, loving them more fully. They are avoiding themselves more completely, using the relationship as a way to escape the demands of the inner life that have not yet been adequately faced. Genuine love, the kind that actually serves the person it is offered to, requires that the person offering it genuinely exist, requires that they maintain enough of a distinct and stable inner reality that they can actually encounter the other person rather than simply using the encounter to manage their own unresolved inner material. And this genuine existence, this stable and distinct inner reality, is precisely what is built through the practice of genuine self-love, of actually being present to your own inner life in the honest, receptive, non-managed way that Jung was describing. Number 7. The life that becomes possible when you genuinely love yourself. The change that occurs when a person genuinely develops their self-relationship, when they begin to meet their own inner life with the kind of honest and compassionate attention that was described in the earlier sections of this video, is not limited to the quality of the romantic relationships in their life, though those often change significantly. It extends to every form of significant human connection they inhabit. The quality of presence they bring to friendship changes, because the person who is genuinely present to themselves is also genuinely present to others, in a way that the person who is primarily managing their inner life cannot quite be. The quality of engagement they bring to their work changes, because the person whose self-relationship is organized around genuine inner reality rather than external validation is capable of acting from genuine inner necessity in a way that produces a different and more sustainable quality of creative and professional engagement. The quality of their experience of ordinary life changes, because the person who has learned to receive their own inner experience without immediate management or deflection has access to a richness and a texture of ordinary experience that the person who is primarily managing their inner life never quite reaches. Jung described the goal of the individuation process as the development of what he called wholeness. Not perfection, not the elimination of difficulty or shadow, or the complicated dimensions of a genuinely lived life, but wholeness, the integration of the full range of what you are, including what is difficult, into a life that is genuinely inhabited rather than primarily managed. And the foundation of that wholeness, the condition that makes it possible, is the development of a genuine and honest relationship with yourself. One that receives what is actually there, rather than what would be more comfortable, or more flattering, or more acceptable. When that relationship is genuinely present, something changes in the atmosphere of every encounter you have. People feel, without being able to explain exactly why, that there is more to meet when they meet you. More substance, more genuine presence, more of a real person rather than a social presentation, and they respond to that substance with a different quality of engagement than they brought before. Not because you have asked them to treat you differently, or because you have decided to accept only certain kinds of treatment, but because the template has changed, because how you love yourself has genuinely shifted, and because the most reliable thing Jung ever observed about human relationships is also the simplest. We teach people how to treat us not through what we say, but through the relationship we model. And that relationship begins, always, with the one we have with ourselves. If something in this video touches a recognition, if the description of what genuine self-love actually requires feels less like inspiration, and more like the beginning of a genuinely demanding and genuinely worthwhile undertaking, leave a word in the comments. Just a word, because sometimes naming where you actually are is the most honest beginning available. And if you want to continue exploring what it means to build the kind of inner life that genuinely changes how you move through the world and what the world reflects back to you, stay close to this work, not to become a more impressive version of yourself, but to finally, genuinely, become the one you actually are. There is something that needs to be said more directly about the specific experience of being in a relationship while this change is in process. Because the transition from the old self-relationship to the new one does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of existing relationships, with people who have organized their engagement with you around the template that the old self-relationship created. And the experience of that transition from inside the relationship is rarely clean or simple. The person who has always been accommodating, who has always made themselves smaller to avoid conflict, who has always positioned their needs as negotiable and their feelings as excessive, does not one day simply begin to behave differently without that difference being felt by the people around them. And the feeling it produces is not always positive, at least not initially. Because what the accommodation was doing, even when it was unconscious and genuinely well-intentioned, was maintaining a particular kind of equilibrium. One that served certain needs on both sides of the relationship, even when it was not genuinely good for either party. When the accommodation begins to reduce, when the person starts to bring more of their actual experience into the interaction, rather than managing it away before it reaches the surface, the equilibrium is disrupted. The partner who was comfortable receiving the accommodation without being required to genuinely meet the other person may experience the change as a withdrawal of something they had counted on. The friend who had organized the friendship around the availability of the always accommodating person may feel that something has shifted in a way they cannot quite locate or name. These disruptions are not signs that the change is wrong. They are signs that the change is real, that something that was genuinely organized in a particular way is now being reorganized. And the test of a relationship's genuine depth is precisely what happens in this period of reorganization. Whether the people in it have the capacity to adjust to the more honest version of the person rather than requiring the managed version to be maintained indefinitely. Jung believed that the relationships which survive this kind of transition, which make room for the more genuinely present person that the inner work is developing, are the relationships that were always capable of genuine depth, that had always contained the possibility of real meeting rather than only the performance of it. And the relationships that do not survive the transition were, very often, organized primarily around the functions that the person was providing rather than around genuine engagement with who the person actually is. This is one of the most consistently confirmed and most consistently uncomfortable findings in the clinical literature that follows Jung's framework. That the development of genuine self-love, of the kind that changes the unconscious template and therefore changes the relational atmosphere, does not preserve all existing relationships. It preserves the ones that were genuinely capable of depth and allows the ones that were organized around the old template to find their natural conclusion. And while every ending has its own grief, the grief that follows the ending of a relationship that could not accommodate who you are genuinely becoming is a grief worth moving through, because what follows it, in the relationships that remain and in the new ones that become possible, is of a quality that the old structure simply could not contain. A woman I knew described this process with a clarity that I have not encountered in any textbook account. She said that as she began to love herself differently, as she began to bring more of her actual experience into her relationships, rather than always editing herself down to something more manageable, she noticed that some people in her life became more interested in her, while others became less so. The ones who became more interested were the ones who had always sensed that there was more to her than what she was offering, and who had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for the fuller version to appear. The ones who became less interested were the ones who had been most comfortable with the edited version, precisely because the edited version was less demanding, less present, less genuinely there in a way that required anything real in return. She did not frame this as loss exactly. She framed it as clarification, as the gradual emergence, from beneath the fog of the managed and accommodating self-presentation, of a picture of who was actually in her life and what they were actually there for. And the picture, once it became clear, was both smaller and more genuinely nourishing than the larger and more populated version that had preceded it. This is what Jung is pointing toward when he says that how you love yourself is how you teach others to love you. Not that the development of self-love will bring you more love in the quantitative sense, more people expressing more positive sentiment toward you across a wider range of social situations, but that it will bring you more genuine love, more actual meeting, more real contact between who you actually are and who the people in your life actually are, and that this more genuine love, even in smaller quantities and from fewer sources, is worth more and sustains more and nourishes more than any amount of the managed and conditional and template-organized love that the old self-relationship was producing. The path to it is not comfortable. It requires a quality of honest self-attention that most people have not been trained to bring to their own inner experience. It requires the willingness to see clearly and to stay with what you see, including the parts that are difficult and the parts that have been carefully hidden even from yourself. It requires the sustained and genuinely demanding practice of remaining present to your own inner reality rather than immediately managing it into an acceptable form. But the practice is not only demanding, it is also, in a very specific and not easily described way, genuinely freeing. There is a particular quality of relief that accompanies the moment of actually being seen, even if the one doing the seeing is yourself. The relief of no longer having to maintain the performance, of no longer having to manage the distance between who you are and who you are presenting, of being able to be, in the fullest and most ordinary sense of that word, actually here, in your own life, as your own person, in genuine rather than performed relationship with yourself, and therefore in ways that gradually and genuinely change everything, in genuine rather than performed relationship with everyone you encounter. This is the destination that the phrase points toward, not a life of perfect self-regard or uninterrupted emotional comfort or relationships with people who never disappoint you, but a life in which the love you give yourself and the love you receive from others are both, finally and genuinely, real, grounded in something actual rather than something managed, built on a foundation of honest self-knowledge and honest self-reception, rather than on the elaborate and exhausting structure of a self-relationship, organized primarily around what others need you to be. Jung believed this was not only possible but necessary, not as a luxury available to people who have the time and resources for extensive self-examination, but as the basic requirement for a human life that is genuinely inhabited rather than primarily performed. and the beginning of it, always, is the same. The willingness to turn toward yourself, honestly and without the usual protections, and to offer what you find there the one thing it has always needed and has rarely received: your genuine and undivided attention. There is a final dimension of this exploration that deserves direct and honest attention. It concerns the specific question of time. How long this change takes, what the realistic arc of the development looks like, because one of the ways that the popular version of self-love most consistently misleads is in suggesting that it is primarily a decision. That if you decide to love yourself, if you choose to adopt the orientation of self-acceptance and self-compassion and healthy self-regard, the decision will produce the change. And this is simply not accurate. Not because decisions are unimportant, but because the change that Jung is describing is not primarily at the level of decision. It is at the level of psychological structure, and psychological structure changes not through decision but through experience, through the accumulated weight of repeated encounters with a different way of being present to yourself over time, until the new way begins to feel not like an effort, but like how things are. This takes longer than most people want it to take. It takes longer than the popular accounts suggest. It takes, in most cases, years rather than months. Not because the person is not working hard enough, or not committed enough, or not sufficiently motivated to change, but because the patterns that need to change were established very early and very deeply, through years of accumulated experience that created psychic structures of genuine density and genuine persistence. And those structures do not dissolve under the force of a good idea or a sincere intention. They dissolve under the sustained pressure of a genuinely different experience, repeated often enough and consistently enough that the structure that was organized around the old experience gradually reorganizes itself around the new one. This is not discouraging if you understand it correctly, because it means that every single moment in which you choose to meet your inner experience differently, in which you bring genuine attention, rather than management, to what is actually happening inside you, every moment in which you stay with something difficult in yourself, rather than immediately redirecting outward, every moment in which you give your own experience the quality of reception that it has not previously received, is genuinely adding to something, is genuinely building something, even when it does not feel like it, even when the change seems slow or inconsistent, or invisible to yourself and to everyone around you. The structure is being gradually reorganized. The template is being slowly but genuinely rewritten. And the love that you are developing for yourself, in these small and often invisible moments of genuine self-attention, is teaching, in the only language that actually reaches another person, what kind of love you are ready to receive. Jung wrote that the most difficult thing is to know yourself. Not to understand yourself in the intellectual sense, not to be able to describe your patterns and your tendencies and your history, but to genuinely know yourself in the lived, experiential sense of actually being present to what you are and what you carry, rather than primarily managing the presentation of it. He believed this knowing, this genuine and ongoing self-encounter, was the foundation of everything that makes a human life genuinely worth living, not the achievement of particular outcomes, not the accumulation of particular experiences or relationships or markers of success, but the ongoing, never complete, always deepening relationship with the most fundamental reality available to any person, which is the reality of who they actually are. And when that relationship is genuinely present, when you have developed enough of a genuine acquaintance with your own inner life to be actually present to yourself, rather than primarily performing for yourself, something changes in the atmosphere of every encounter you have with the world, the people you meet, the relationships you enter, the love that you are capable of offering, and the love that you are capable of genuinely receiving. All of it begins to shift in quality, not in quantity, not in the sense that everything becomes easier or more pleasant or more consistently rewarding, but in the sense that it becomes more real, more genuinely yours, more actually connected to who you actually are rather than to who you have been required to be. This is what the phrase means, finally and fully and without simplification. How you love yourself is how you teach others to love you, not as an instruction to love yourself more, but as an observation about the most fundamental mechanism of human relationship. that what you offer to others in the deepest sense of offering is always, in the end, shaped by what you offer to yourself. That the quality of the love available in your life from the world and the people around you is not, ultimately, determined by their character or their capacity or their willingness. It is determined by the template you carry, by the model you embody, by the relationship you have, day by day and moment by moment, with the most important person in your psychological life, yourself. And the beauty of this, the genuinely hopeful and genuinely actionable beauty of it, is that this is the one relationship in the world that you have the most capacity to change. Beginning, always, from exactly where you currently are. If this video has touched something that you have been carrying for a long time, something about the way you love yourself and what that has produced in the people and the relationships around you, leave a word in the comments. Not a story or an explanation, just a word that names what you recognized in what you heard. Because sometimes the act of naming what has always been present but never quite spoken is the first genuine movement towards something different. And if you want to continue this exploration, to keep working at the frontier between where your self-relationship currently is and where it could genuinely be, stay close to this channel. Not to learn how to seem like someone who loves themselves, but to actually, gradually, genuinely become one.